living in France versus living in the United States. So I have a fun little video for today. As a French person who currently lives in Paris, but who also lived in the United States as I was growing up, I thought it would be fun to kind of share the differences between living in France and living in the United States. I know that I have a lot of American viewers who are really interested in the French way of life, so I thought that this would be interesting. So of course, as you may or may not know, I'm a nutritionist, so we're gonna start out with food. In France, you'll find more traditional meals, especially as you kind of go around different regions. They're all gonna have like their different specialties with their like traditional recipes and local ingredients and things like that. And also, like, speaking about ingredients in general in France, ingredients are, I would say, higher quality. They just like taste better, and they have this whole quality over quantity mindset. So they would rather have fewer things but higher quality than the opposite. So they're going to tend to have smaller portion sizes, but they're not going to be afraid of spending a little bit more money to get ingredients that are actually locally sourced and that are in season and that are just like quality ingredients in general, and that's going to make their meals like more satisfying, and they're going to be satisfied with like smaller portions of higher quality meals. In general, they are going to eat more whole foods, and they're going to make food more than like American people. It's not really common in France to eat out or to like order takeout. Like if you eat out, it's like this whole experience. You go to the restaurant, it's like a whole thing, but it's really not common to just order takeout. That's like really on special occasions. We really like to home cook meals and also eat as a family. French people really like to just sit down and enjoy the meal, have like an entire social event around it, and really take the time to eat. And they're also like really mindful about what they're eating and their food, and they're not just like shoveling food down their throats while they're looking at the TV and like standing up and like thinking about what they're gonna do next. It's not like that in France. In the USA, food is just more convenient in general. You're gonna have like supermarkets open almost 24/7. You can literally go grocery shopping whenever you want. You're always gonna have room. There's always gonna be stuff available. You're always gonna have a bunch of different options of everything. That's not the case in France at all. It's also very convenient if you want to order takeout. There's like tons of apps to like get meal delivery, all of that. It's starting to be a little bit more popular in France, but still nowhere near as popular as in the US. And I think that while that convenience is obviously like really good and convenient, it can also sometimes take away from making the time to cook a meal and the like whole eating experience, because you're like, why would I spend an hour cooking when I can just like press 2 buttons and have food at my doorstep? And then in general, the portions are much larger than in France, and it tends to be like way more processed than in France too. Like as a French person, I was absolutely shocked when I first saw American portions. Like it's out of this world. Like it's not a joke when you say the smallest American size is the biggest French size. Like it's true. So now when it comes to education, there are quite a few differences. I would say that in general, the French system has more rules and is more like regulated, whereas the American system is a little bit more free and a little bit more like tailored to each individual kid's needs. In France, school is mandatory from the age of 3, whereas in the United States, you have preschool that is like optional, and you can only start school in kindergarten if you want. And then in France, homeschooling is not a thing. Like there are people who homeschool, but usually it's because they have like very specific schedules, maybe like child actors or something. And it's something that is very followed closely and regulated closely by the government. Like you can't just do anything you want. There's like a specific curriculum you have to stick to, and then there are like exams you have to pass. Whereas in the US, homeschooling is like very normal, and like lots of people homeschool, lots of kids homeschool, and they don't have any specific like rules to that. I'm sure there's like tests that they have to take to make sure they're meeting the standards, but they can just like learn in whatever way their parents want them to learn. The level in France is also much harder than in the United States in general. It's harder to get good grades And I would remember that when I was in the US, it was just so easy to get good grades. I would like not study for tests and still get good grades. I would get like straight A's on my report cards all the time. Like if I had like an A minus, I was like sad. But in France, there's a grading system out of 20, so you get a grade out of 20, and it starts to be considered as a good grade when you get 14 out of 20. So that's 70%, and that is, I believe, like a C minus equivalent. So that's not good in like US standards. So of course, you know, standards have adapted to the level demanded in each country, but that was like really weird for me as like a straight A student coming to France and being like, what is this? What are these horrible grades when they were actually good? Also, the school days are much longer in France, but also you have way more vacation, and most students will not have school on Wednesday afternoon. That's like kind of a thing. When it comes to higher education in France, first of all, it's free. Like the rest of the education, it's free. I mean, you will have like maybe a little fee, but it's essentially free when you compare it to the United States. And I mean, unless you want to go to like a private school, then you have to pay, but still nowhere near the amounts. I think that if you do like most like private schools, it's going to be maybe like 10K a year, something like that, I believe. And then I would say that the entrance exams are very hard. It's like very selective, very difficult to get in, but then the level is very good, and it's mainly about your like academic achievements. They don't really care about extracurriculars or like your personality or whatever. It's kind of like just your grades. Now when it comes to the USA, I would say that there is a lot more like opportunity and like variety when it comes to school. Like you can go to public schools, and then like depending on which public school you're at, there's going to be like a different curriculum, a different way of doing things. It's not like a national curriculum like it is in France. You can also go to like different private schools. There's like Montessori schools, and you can also homeschool. Like I said earlier, it's like a thing in the US. And then when it comes to education in general, it's much more flexible, much more like adapted to each student. It's much more in like a reward-based system rather than like a punishment-based system, which is like what it's like in France. And when it comes to higher education as well, I feel like you can get into a really good school. Of course, you have to have good grades, but it's also going to be depending on like extracurriculars, if you like volunteer, if you work somewhere, if you are like outgoing, your personality, those things are going to matter. In France, that doesn't really matter. And like higher education is very selective as well in the US, and also very expensive. When it comes to like general lifestyle, I feel like France is just like way more compact compared to the USA. It's just everything is smaller. Like homes are smaller, and then inside the home, fridges are smaller, and like doors are smaller, beds are smaller, closets are smaller. And then if you go outside, roads are so small in France. Like sometimes there's like no room for 2 cars. You have to like go to the side. It's horrible. Stores are much smaller as well. Like the aisles in stores are much smaller, and even people tend to be smaller, like in size in France. And then in France, there's really this emphasis on the art of living and like la joie de vivre and just enjoying life in general. And they have like French people have a great work-life balance. So it's all about doing your job, of course, doing that well, whatever. But then once you're done, and you have time to go out and like see friends, or like eat with your family, or go to theater, do whatever you want, like do exercise, whatever. Of course there are exceptions, but in general it's way more, there's like way better balance. And French people also have like at least 5 weeks of paid vacation every year, and that way they can just go on vacation whenever they want. I would also say that in general, French people have a more relaxed approach to life. There isn't this like hustle culture that's present in the US, where you have to be productive all the time and where resting is like a waste of time. It's not like that in France. They will gladly sit multiple hours at a cafe with their friends, just like drinking coffee or like having a little bit of alcohol, like red wine, whatever, and just like talking, watching people go by, watching like the city street. And then obviously in the USA it's the opposite. Everything is bigger. It's just like spacious living. Everything is just easier and more convenient. When it comes to services, it's like almost a 24/7 thing. There's always somebody to help. There's always something you can do, always something you can get to eat. And that's actually pretty similar to Paris and France, but if you look at France in general, it's not like that at all. Like, stores will be closing from noon to 2 p.m. and while they eat, they have their lunch break, and then they will be closing early, and then they will be closed on Sundays. So the lifestyle in the US is way more fast-paced. It's about like being super productive and trying to like make a name for yourself. There's also this like American dream mentality that you can be nobody and become like very successful, and I think that's really good. I think that that can be like very driving, motivating for tons of people. I just think that if it's like overdone, it can be a little bit toxic, where you don't even like allow yourself to enjoy the small beautiful moments of life because you're too busy like chasing being like somebody. Now when it comes to fashion in France, it's more of like elegant, sophisticated, and there's also this like quality over quantity approach even in clothes. French people would rather have clothes that are higher quality and have less of them, have more like staple kind of like timeless pieces. And also French people tend to be well dressed for anything they have to do, like running errands, going to school, all of that. They are always going to be like well dressed and like put together. And that's like a huge difference from in the US, where it's kind of like way more casual. You can just wear whatever. Like you can literally go to university in like pajamas and flip-flops, and that's like normal. And like in France, you like that would not work. I also like this side of the US. I feel like there's no judgment on the clothing like department. You can like just wear whatever you want. Nobody really cares. Whereas in France, everybody's gonna kind of like judge you based on how you're dressed. Like if you see somebody going into a grocery store and they're like in pajamas, it's weird. We also have like a very different way of seeing clothes that are like casual and that are like dressed. Like some clothes that I feel are like casual would be like overdressed and like an American party, for instance. So, but there's also this kind of like other aspect of Americans, I feel like, that either they're gonna be like really super casual, or they're gonna be like super all out full glam, like prom dress and like full hair and makeup, like full face. Whereas in France, we never really do that. We kind of like always stay kind of in the middle. There's never gonna be like a huge difference in the way that we look. Whereas I feel like American women, huge difference. Now another thing that really surprised me as a French person in the United States was how different like the religion aspect was. In France, there is a strong separation of church and state, and religion is a very personal matter. It will not interfere in like public space. Like public spaces, public institution, all of that, they're secular. You can't show any kind of like religious sign, and people generally don't talk about their religion at all. And it's again something that's like very private. Whereas in the USA, obviously there is no separation. The president is sworn in like on the Bible, which in France would be absolutely wild. And so then people are way more like expressive with their religion. They're very like open to like discussing it and like talking about what they do when it comes to like religious matters. And religion in the US is like really intertwined with public life. I mean, again, as a child, it shocked me. I mean, not then, but like in hindsight now, that I had to say the Pledge of Allegiance with like my hand and say like under God. And it's like nobody cares what you believe in or not. You just kind of have to do it. It's kind of like normal. When it comes to art and culture, it's maybe one of the topics where I feel like they are most similar. Also, probably because I live in Paris, where there are like a bunch of options for like art and like history and cultural things. And also in like I lived in Chicago and it was the same thing. I would say since in France in general there's like more public funding for museums and like cultural activities, things like that, there tends to be more of them, especially in Paris. There's just like museums everywhere, theaters, operas, like things to do all the time everywhere. In France, there's a huge history, obviously much bigger than the American history, so there's gonna be so many sites to visit, like so many castles and like old houses and like old villages and things where you can really learn about like how people used to live and like all the history surrounding it. So that's a really, really huge thing. And also I feel like especially in Paris, there is very, very big importance of cultural activity. Then I would say that the USA definitely has like a bigger impact culturally than France. Then in the US still, I feel like depending on where you live, there can be like lots of options for cultural historical sites. But again, since it's mainly like funded by it's like funded locally or like by donations, things like that, then it's gonna vary a little bit depending on the place that you're in. And definitely the US is a big melting pot, so there's like tons of like different cultural aspects to it, which is amazing. And finally, when it comes to social aspects, there are also huge differences between both countries. French people can really seem initially very cold and like not welcoming, very like distant, unless you're really in like a southern French village where people are typically much more much friendlier. People will not be friendly by default in France. People only become friendly if you like become their friends, but like the default setting is not to be friendly to strangers. Like if you want to go buy something, they're gonna be polite. Yeah, I mean most of them. They're not gonna be like friendly. They're not gonna like ask you how your day was, which is like crazy. Again, when I went to the States and people were like, hi, how are you doing? How's your day? Like I know it's like politeness, but still I was like, what? You're smiling at me? You're like engaging in like conversation and you're not mad at me for anything? Like this is wonderful. But in reality, even if they seem like that, French people, it's just that it takes a long time to kind of like form a friendship with them. But once you have formed like a friendship, once you have that created that bond, then they are so loyal. They will be there for you. You will like do everything together. I'm just kidding, but still, it's people who are just going to be like very present in your life and going to be an important part of your life forever. Because in France, like deep, long-lasting connections are very, very valued. So in the USA, again, it's the total opposite. People are initially so friendly. I went back to Chicago a few months ago and I was just blown away by how friendly everybody was. Everybody just wants to help you. People are always talking to you, asking you how you're doing. Just like, it's just so nice and it's just such great energy to be around. However, I found that it is harder to build meaningful friendships with American people. Like from all the time I spent in the US, I have like 2 American friends. And then from a French perspective, they see Americans as being like very superficial, like they're gonna be super friendly at first, but when you actually like need them, there's like nobody. It's kind of like French people see that as like hypocritical. So American people see French people as cold and French people see American people as like superficial. American people are just so casual, spontaneous, easygoing in their relationships, and in France it's just more complicated. There are like layers you need to get through before you have like a connection with somebody. So that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you want to see more content like this. Probably I can make like a video for each individual subcategory because there's just so much to say about that. So if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe, and see you on my next one. Bye.